Hello and welcome to my weekly podcast, Through the Bible in 10 Years, or 20. I've been doing a diversion for the last few weeks, stuff you didn't know about Acts. You may know it or you may disagree with it, but today we're in Acts chapter 6. Stuff you didn't know about Acts 6. This is a really short chapter. It's only 15 verses, and yet to me it is a really fascinating chapter where we get some really interesting insights into the early church and some interestingly very applicable issues, I think, to today's church as well. Let me recommend to you today Willie Jennings' commentary on Acts, which it's not primarily focused on the original meaning, but it does hit hard, I think, some possible applications of Acts for today. So I thought I'd put in a plug for that. Stuff you didn't know about Acts 6. So the chapter begins with these two groups, the Hebrews and the Hellenists. And I think when I was growing up, I always thought that the Hellenists were Greeks and the Hebrews were Jews. But now, stuff you didn't know about Acts 6. Actually, the gospel has not jumped to Gentiles yet in the book of Acts. That happens in Acts 10. These are all Jews. The Hellenists are Greek-speaking Jews, and the Hebrews are Aramaic-speaking Jews. So they're all Jews. Everybody in this chapter are Jews. But there is a social stratification, I would say, between the Aramaic-speaking Jews and the Greek-speaking Jews. The Aramaic-speaking Jews think they're just a little bit superior to the Greek-speaking Jews, probably. That would be a natural dynamic. The Greek-speaking Jews are Jews who have, as it were, come back from the diaspora to Jerusalem. What is the diaspora? Diaspora is the scattering of the Jews around the world. The Jews, of course, were scattered in the Babylonian exile, and the Jews were scattered in the centuries also prior to the New Testament. And so this may be news, stuff you didn't know, there were far more Jews living outside of Jerusalem than there were Jews living inside Jerusalem. In fact, there may have been more Jews living in just the Egyptian city of Alexandria than there were Jews in all of Jerusalem. Alexandria was a much bigger city with a heavy Jewish population. And therefore, there were far more Jews at the time of Christ who spoke Greek, I would say, than there were Jews that spoke Aramaic, which is the normal speaking language in Palestine at the time, I think, in Galilee and in Judea. And so when I say return to Jerusalem, I don't mean they were born in Jerusalem, they moved away and they came back. I mean that maybe their grandparents had lived in Palestine or Jerusalem, or who knows how long. But there is this thing. I mean, we've seen it even in our own the last two generations in our own lifetimes, that there have been Jews who've moved from Russia to Palestine, or from the Middle East to Palestine, or from America back to Palestine, and so you can see this, that there were Jews who say, "Man, maybe when I'm older, I'll be able to move back home." And we're gonna come across a synagogue in a second called the Synagogue of the Freedmen, and so you can see a backstory to that name, even of Jews who were maybe slaves or servants out there in the world, and said, "One day when I get my freedom, I'm going to move back to Jerusalem." And apparently there was a sizable enough population of Jewish servants that moved back to Jerusalem that there was a whole synagogue with that name. Whatever the origins are, there were Greek-speaking, diaspora-centered Jews who were living in Jerusalem. Paul may very well have been in that group when he came from Tarsus. Now, the book of Acts probably pushes us away from that idea because he's training to be a Pharisee, and he calls himself a Hebrew of the Hebrews. But even when Paul says that, "I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews," we speak Hebrew, we speak Aramaic in my home, okay, I may be from Tarsus, but we speak Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic when we're at the dinner table. Paul, it was a thing. Obviously, it was a thing. Paul wants to make it clear, "I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews." So he's an Aramaic-speaking Jew. I'm sorry. He did speak Aramaic, Paul did. But there were Aramaic-speaking Jews like Peter and James and John. There were Aramaic-speaking Jews, and then there were Greek-speaking Jews. And there were people who believed on Jesus from both groups. That's also clear, right? This is a dispute among believers. And there are Greek-speaking believers, and there are Aramaic-speaking believers. Another interesting thing we learn in the very first verse is that there was a daily distribution to widows. There's no Social Security in the first century. The synagogue's not going to clearly take care of you. And so one of the features of the early churches, they took care of their own widows. If a widow didn't have a family to take care of her, she was in big trouble. And so one of the features of the early church was a distribution of food, of bread, to the widows, a daily distribution, because of course it got bad. We hear about this in 1 Timothy 5, where apparently eventually there were women who, at least at that time, it was thought that it was better that they remarry rather than be a burden to the church. I mean, it doesn't say that in 1 Timothy 5, but basically the advice of 1 Timothy 5 is if they're under 60, let them remarry. Let's set a limit of being 60 years old for the church to distribute to widows. It's very interesting. We'll get to 1 Timothy, I suppose, eventually if I live that long. But there's a daily distribution to widows that happened from the very beginning, according to the book of Acts. The 12 seem to be the core of the church. The 12 call everybody together to take care of the issue. There's this dispute. Basically, what the Greek-speaking widows are saying, why aren't you taking care of us? It seems like the Aramaic-speaking widows all get plenty of bread. Their perception is a piece of bread for an Aramaic-speaking widow, a piece of bread for an Aramaic-speaking widow, a piece of bread for an Aramaic-speaking widow. Oh, did we run out again? Sorry, Greek-speaking widows, we've run out of bread. That's the way, at least, the Greek-speaking widows perceive the situation to be. And so there's this dispute. It's not fair. You're not taking care of us. You're showing favoritism to the Aramaic-speaking widows. And so the 12 call the church together to solve the problem. They haven't left Jerusalem yet. My former colleague Dave Smith used to say it would take the death of Stephen, whom we're going to meet in a second, for the church to do what the Great Commission told them to do from the very beginning, go and to make disciples of every nation. Why are the 12 all in Jerusalem? Why are they still here? They should be out, But anyway, the 12 are still in Jerusalem, and in the world of Acts, I assume Matthias is the 12th, replacing Judas in this group. But the 12 are still there, and they're going to solve the problem. Peter seems to be a little taken off guard. Now, you might disagree with me, but it seems to me he's a little flustered here. The lady doth protest too much, methinks. I don't have time to wait tables. I'm supposed to be praying. I've got to pray. I personally think that taking care of others is part of the job of, or making sure they get taken care of is part of the responsibility of leadership. And so I actually, I'm not sure that I think I find a little blame here. I think, and I don't know that it was intentional. I hope it wasn't intentional. But it's easy to overlook those who aren't in our group. It's easy to overlook those that we don't see. And I'm not sure that Peter saw the Greek-speaking Hellenists. He was focused maybe on his little clique. I taught at Indiana Wesleyan University for a number of years, and I don't think I fully realized how there was a kind of there may have been, maybe this is wrong, a Wesleyan clique, as it were. Those who taught at Indiana Wesleyan who weren't Wesleyan sometimes felt a little bit like they were outsiders, I think. That probably wasn't a good thing. But I feel like, you're in the in group. You're the privileged group. That horrible word, right? But I mean, the Aramaic speakers, I think, were privileged because they were at the core of the group, of the demographic group that was the core of the church. They were there. And so the Greek-speaking Jews were more easily overlooked or not seen because they weren't in the core group. And Peter seems a little taken off guard here because I think a blind spot of his, he probably wants to be perfect. And they've pointed out a blind spot that he has missed something. But they take care of it, right? Now, this chapter is often considered to be the model for what a deacon is. A deacon is someone who waits tables, as it were. A deacon is somebody who takes care of the more mundane aspects of the church. And that's all. That's all. There's nothing wrong with having deacons in the church, but it's interesting that the book of Acts never calls them deacons. There were deacons in the early church. Phoebe in Romans 16, a woman, is called a deacon. But these individuals become evangelists. They don't become deacons. In fact, we never see them waiting tables. We see Stephen preaching among the Hellenists. We find Philip is explicitly called Philip the evangelist later on in the book of Acts. And they're all Hellenists. If you look at the names of the people that are appointed, these 7 men, Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, Nicholas from Antioch, a convert. He's not even originally a Jew. He's a convert to Judaism. He's a proselyte. And so the people that they appoint are not Jew, or are not Aramaic. There are no Aramaic-speaking people. This is not a bipartisan committee for the taking care of widows in Jerusalem. They basically authorize people within the Hellenistic community to take care of the Hellenistic community. So Peter doesn't ever take care directly of the Hellenistic community, from what I can see here. And so, again, this is one of those where, I feel like this is indicating a bigger problem than just waiting of tables. And the bigger problem is that there is a whole demographic that is not being ministered to or even evangelized to as much as the Aramaic-speaking community. And they take care of it, of course. There's nothing wrong with this solution, I don't think. Peter doesn't know Greek very well, I assume. And so it makes perfect sense for them to in fact, you can see a principle of use national leadership. Don't have the missionary lead the church in the foreign land. Have people in the foreign land lead the church in the foreign land, and so called and so on. Indigenous or national individuals. So there's a model there that is perfectly fine and legitimate. So I don't actually personally think of this as the deacon chapter, because none of these people look to become deacons. They become ministers of that community. I would say that Acts 6-7 probably ends the first major section of Acts. I've changed a little bit over time here. I used to say Acts 1-7 as a unit, and this is close. But the repetition of the phrase increased and multiplied seems to be significant for the structure of the book of Acts. So the first major section of Acts seems to end with Acts 6-7. Just a few more things, more stuff, and we'll be done with stuff you didn't know about Acts 6. So we don't, again, see Stephen waiting tables. We see him doing miracles, and we see him preaching. Stephen is one of the 7 that are appointed. His preaching, as we'll see next week when we get his sermon in Acts 7, seems to be somewhat controversial. In fact, there's a stronger response to Stephen than to Peter's preaching. Very interesting. Peter seems to be, the Sanhedrin gets upset with Peter, but Peter seems to be able to preach just fine in the temple precincts. Stephen seems a little bit more, maybe, in your face than Peter's preaching. Maybe, just maybe. His audience is a Hellenist audience. Alexandrians, that's in Egypt. Cilicia, where Paul's from. Asia, that's also modern-day Turkey. Cyrenian, which is North Africa. And again, it's called the Synagogue of the Freedmen. Now, sometimes those who aren't in the center are even more zealous than those who are born into it. My wife is a quarter Greek, and sometimes you joke about, you can tell a Greek family because they have a Statue of Liberty in their front yard. That's a joke, of course. But people who have come to America from a foreign land sometimes are more patriotic than even the people who've born here and take America for granted. That's not always the case. But what I'm getting at is, it may very well be that these Greek-speaking Jews who had dreamed their whole life of moving back to Jerusalem, they may actually have been more zealous for the law than many people who were born in Jerusalem or who were born in Palestine. And so it may very well be that they reacted more strongly to Stephen's preaching than the Aramaic speakers in Jerusalem reacted to Peter's preaching. It may be a both and. It may be both that Stephen was a little more in your face and that they were a little bit more zealous for the law on average. It may have been a two-hit wonder here, and that both of them combined, Stephen's going to die. If you haven't figured it out, he's about to die. They bring him up on charges. He's against Moses, they say. He's against the temple. He's going to change Moses' customs. These sound like things that were later brought against the Apostle Paul, for example. And it's interesting because the Apostle Paul seems to be used by the by the Sanhedrin. Paul seems to have been primarily targeting, I think, Greek-speaking Christians. So even Paul's persecution wasn't primarily against Aramaic-speaking Christians, maybe, but Paul's persecution was against Greek-speaking Christians, perhaps. It seems like he's being used by the Sanhedrin to quell Christianity or address Christianity in that demographic, in the Greek-speaking Christian demographic. Was Stephen against the temple? Well, he does minimize the temple in chapter 7. He says, you stiff-necked people. God doesn't dwell in buildings made by hands. So he does. You could see where they would interpret him to be against the temple. You could see him. Is he against the temple? I doubt that Stephen was actually against the temple in principle. Stephen may very well have been against the temple leadership. He may have very well been against the way the temple was being operated and things like that. The Essenes had that same thing. The Essenes at this time did not consider the temple to be legitimate. They believed there would be a new temple and a purified leadership. So when it said, he may have said things critical of the temple without necessarily being against the temple itself per se. Change the customs of Moses. Certainly these are things that Paul would be accused of. And we'll see next week. Next week we will read Stephen's sermon, and let's keep this in mind, these charges against Stephen, and see how someone could take what he actually preaches and perhaps interpret him that way. This has been Stuff You Didn't Know About Acts chapter 6.